After the breathtaking and rather wonderful history of the snail Martin Warnke reported on, it's really quite a challenge to start the business of responding. Allow me now to follow the snail's trace of energetic movement and the stretched antennas from Hamburg back to London. 37 years ago, a conference and an exhibition in Hamburg marking the 50th anniversary of Warburg's death had enormous after effects in terms of regaining Warburgian thinking and his house, the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg. In addition to Werner Hoffmann and Georg Syamkin, one of the protagonists at the time was Martin Warnke, who did such important work to explain Warburg's basic terms or 4 keywords on the advice of Henning Ritter, he told me. In 1979, these basic terms were iconology, pathos formula, polarity and balance, and Schlagbilder and Bilderfahrzeuge. The response was overwhelming and can be felt in Warburg research to this day, as in the project Bilderfahrzeuge at the Warburg Institute today. And today we can also see how familiar and natural these actually quite hermetic and metaphorical terms have become for us. Even if Aby Warburg was only implicitly hidden in Laurent Destin's paper, almost everybody in this room will inevitably have thought of Warburg's metaphors, phrases, or formulations when Goffman's sharp eye for the telling vignette, Baxendale's directing our attention to apparently minor detail, or the description of how exemplar undermine conventional wisdom were mentioned. In this session, a whole series of terms have been added that can also be seen as Warburgian basic terms, but which first have to be conquered philologically or speculatively. Detail, gute Nachbarschaft, physiological expression or Ausdruck, hieroglyph and Zwischenraum. And we have seen how certain formulations like Umfangsbestimmung, circumscription, or thesis and motives from reading Darwin and also the famous Nympher have wandered to and fro between these lectures on such varying themes. I just missed one name that could be in the background of some of the papers in this section. I'm thinking here of William Heckscher and his 1974 essays on Petite Perception, an account of thought Warburgiane. In this essay, Heckscher assembled a few observations that have come my way, but the article is framed by the attempt to trace the source or genealogy of the Warburgian formula God dwells in minutiae, der liebe Gott steckt im Detail, or in Fritz Sachsel's and Laurent Destin's variant, truth lies buried in detail. Heckscher names as the first trace Leibnizs' notion of petite perception, which also gave his article its title. As a second author, Heckscher names Giambattista Vico and quotes the following passage from his Scientia Nova. Human beings sense at first without noticing. Next, they register impressions with a mind that is perturbed and agitated. Finally, they reflect with pure intellect. Heckscher linked this sentence with Warburg's psychohistorical and anthropological foundations in his Bildwissenschaft. He regarded it as a parallel of Warburg's essential differentiation between Greifmensch, Künstler, and Denkmensch, or the 3 modes of circumscription, which can be read as ways of distancing, grasping, appropriating for the Greifmensch, searching, depicting for the artists, and speaking, writing for the Denkmensch. The connection of this model to Warburg's reading of Darwin was shown by Sigrid Weigel. However, in the 1970s, Heckscher just divined the link between Warburg and Vico in a speculative manner. I have no direct evidence for his having come across the passage on the petite perception, let alone Vico's remark on the 3 degrees of perception we read in a footnote. Although an inquiry to the librarian and later director of the Warburg Institute, J.B. Trapp, yielded positive answers in terms of the library's holdings, Heckscher had no positive proof that Warburg had actually read the passage. Therefore, Christopher Johnson's quotation from Warburg's letter from 1925, our new research direction, which actually realizes an idea of Vico's, was for me a very surprising discovery, even if it remains open what Warburg concretely refers to here. But Heckscher names a 3rd trace leading to God dwelling in minutiae, Horace Walpole's The 3 Princes of Serendip. And he quotes that passage that Andreas Bayer also quoted earlier today. They were always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things which they were not in quest of. Andreas Bayer has described the proximity and distance of serendipity und guter Nachbarschaft quite vividly and explained the idea of the chance placed in inverted commas. In Heckscher, in the notes, as always in his writings, there is an anecdote about Panofsky, who, asked about his interest in the petite perception, is said to have quoted himself, "We are chiefly affected by which we allow to affect us." Heckscher probably did not share this rationalization. Rather, in conversation with Elizabeth Sears, he described serious play as the motive for iconology and made free association the foundation of scholarly investigation. The more you constrict yourself with a program, the less your chances to find things. And referring to Warburg, he says, "And that I think is Warburg's great force, which I call a liberating force." Let's hope the Warburg Institute and Warburg Scholarship will continue to pursue this claim to enlightenment in as open and diverse a manner as it does today.
Hello, I'd like to address myself first quickly to Siegfried Weigel's talk and then move on to ideas that Christopher Johnson's talk suggested to me that I think connect well with, in particular, moments in Lorraine Daston's talk and Andreas Bayer's talk. While listening to Siegfried Weigel's talk, I took a look at the table of contents of Charles Darwin's expression of the emotions in man and animals, and noticed that while the title of Chapter 7 is Low Spirits, Anxiety, Grief, Dejection, Despair, the title of Chapter 8 is Joy, High Spirits, Love, Tender Feelings, Devotion. And the alternative interpretation occurred to me that maybe when he met Mary, he realized he didn't need this book anymore. The other thing that the talk suggested to me is if its argument is correct, that Warburg may have recognized that the expression of the emotions in real men, women, and animals is not so much a matter of convention as a matter of nature, or at least not so much a matter of the kind of convention one finds and can trace in works of art, then that makes Darwin's, or one of Darwin's central questions in the book, whether the expression of the emotions in man and animals, real ones, is in fact a matter of nature or a matter of convention or somewhere on a continuum between. It makes it interesting to me. I mean, I asked the question which I can't answer, but maybe you can. Where does Warburg actually end up on that question or on that continuum? Does he end up believing that the expression of the emotions in man and animals is a natural biological thing primarily or predominantly, or does he believe that that's conventional? I think answering that question about Warburg on how people work might shed some interesting light on whether or not, or the degree to which he may have decided that Darwin was relevant to the interpretation of works of art. So much for the Darwin side of things. Regarding Christopher Johnson's argument, the argument is very complex, so the confusion may be mine. But it seemed to me as if there was some confusion between hieroglyphs as an object of interpretation and diagrams as a method of interpretation. It seems to me that Warburg was not trying to produce hieroglyphs or hieroglyphic interpretive objects, but he was trying to decipher objects that he considered hieroglyphic. There are moments in your talk where you seem to use iconographic as a quasi-synonym of hieroglyphic. It seems that the continuum you're describing in Warburg's development is from an iconographic focus on objects that we can consider hieroglyphic and isolated in some sense, or relatively isolated in some sense from other objects, towards an attempt to put these objects considered hieroglyphic formerly subject to iconographic interpretation alone into more complex networks of relationship that you describe as diagrammatic. And I don't doubt that that progression is happening in Warburg's work. I just question whether the interpretive method can be properly described as hieroglyphic. But be that as it may, the confusion could also be Warburg's, by which I mean that it feels to me, it sounds to me from the argument that Warburg is working out a polarity, a tension, or something that for him is a tension, that he is sensing that there is a psychic or some sort of danger in hieroglyphs, in the inscrutability of hieroglyphs, that needs to be corrected by something. One of the dangers of hieroglyphs, one of the dangers of the post-Horapollo, pre-Champollion, or maybe the post-Champollion view of what Horapollo was about, is that one, if you're faced with an uninterpretable but very sort of exciting and promising artifact, you're very tempted to project into it what you think it should mean, which is what the Renaissance tended to do with hieroglyphs, but then the Egyptian hieroglyphs and Horapollo's hieroglyphs, but then it did develop, the Renaissance did develop what you could call a corrective method, which is the emblematic method. It becomes, the inscrutable images become supplied with beginning networks of explication with the superscript and the subscript. The words get attached to images in an attempt to make more of them than the images themselves are. Now, I know that what Christopher, you're calling the diagrammatic method of the Mnemosyne Atlas has often been compared with what was going on in the world of cinema at exactly the same time, which is montage, 1924. I mean, the high point is 1924, Kuleshov's theorization of montage, and the spread of montage as a particular technique of articulating relationships between images in order to construct meanings. I also think I know, because I've looked for this in the archive, that Warburg was paying absolutely no attention to any of this. I found very little material on Warburg and film, and what there is dates from 1915 to 1918, and is definitely thematic. It's, I mean, he pays attention to a film called Das Himmelsschiff, and it's clear he's interested in airplanes and dirigibles. It does seem to me that some sort of comparison of what's going on in film and what's going on in Warburg could be productive, could be useful, because both are confronted with the problem of making meaning out of, in the relating together of images that may be meaningless or may not yield their meanings easily, or may only yield meanings if articulated together this way, and can be articulated together in all sorts of ways. This is one of the things that the Soviet theorists of montage realized, that you can make all kinds of meanings out of still images simply based on the way you edit them together. And let me go back to my idea about polarity. Warburg, we know, was constantly rearranging his images. He was constantly trying to edit together a new film. That very fact suggests to me that he may have been anxious, may have been worried by the insight, conscious or unconscious, that you can always make a new kind of meaning. That the meanings won't necessarily hold. The meanings may be coming from the person who puts them together. I think that, this anxiety before the psychological peril of projection is a dominant feature or is one dominant feature of Warburg's work. And I think his alternation, or this tension that Christopher, you described between the dangerous reading of hieroglyphs iconographically and the possibly not so dangerous articulation of them diagrammatically, may be an answer to insight into that problem. Now, where this, I think, could connect with Lorraine Daston's talk and with Andreas Bayer's talk is that in the first case, we're confronted with the question of how do you know if the examples you've chosen are the right or representative of reality, or maybe you've chosen them because they correspond to what you want to find there. That's the worry that I think Warburg may have had. With Andreas Bayer's talk, serendipity, it seems to me, is a methodological solution to that very problem. How do you not come up with the model that you went to the data trying to find? Well, you organize some sort of what I'll call a constraint that will force you to encounter data you didn't expect to find. In other words, the method of serendipity may be a corrective to the problem of projection, to which Warburg's diagrammatic method, but also the constant rearrangement, may also have been a kind of response. So I think that's all I had to say, and you're making gestures at me, so that's good. Okay.
I would like to discuss the diagrams, because I think different diagrams have very different functions and meanings and impacts. And the first time I came across the amount of different figures of knowledge, I would like to denote this. It was when I studied the notes of Nympha Fiorentina, and was astonished that the notes are full of family trees and tableaus. And I think especially the tableau I wouldn't integrate in your paradigm of hieroglyphic diagrams that are positioned between magic and logic or mathematics, rational approaches and magical approaches, because the tableau in Warburg's notes mainly tries to combine two different lines, a classification and a timeline, a genealogy. And I have a very certain interpretation of his getting mad, because my reading is that he not only got mad because of the First World War, but also because his repeatedly attempt to bring historical development and classification in one system. He did this again and again. And what's so fascinating, that he had a certain attitude that in a certain time rhythm, he came back to this attempt. So for example, in the notebook, symbolism as determination of scope, there is nearly a 1 year rhythm when he tried to develop a new system of classification and in the same time timeline. So, and this, it's impossible. I mean, you can't get the whole world and history just in one system. But he started again and again. So therefore, I think it's a totally different figure of knowledge than the examples from the Lucer essay and so on, where he analyzes astrology and astronomy and the relationship between both, between science and mythic or magical approaches.
I would entirely agree that there's a qualitative distinction between a tabular diagram, one that classifies, one that, if you will, visits the topos of the mad encyclopedist who tries to know everything by himself or herself. However, I would want to make a qualitative distinction between tabular diagrams and more spatiotemporal diagrams. In other words, the table, a great example would be in the Schemata Pathos Formel notebook, in which he lists all of the astrological texts and figures that he is interested in, and calls it syntaxis diataxis. And diataxis is a synonym for dispositio, for arrangement. The fact that, as you suggest, he fails in this, or this may be a contributing factor to his madness, to me confirms that the centrality of whatever we want to call it, if we don't want to call it a diagram, we can call it a table, but the attempt to spatialize knowledge, perhaps, or figure knowledge in a spatial manner remains constant. And my argument reductively is that that spatialization includes, and this speaks to Peter's commentary and very, I think, trenchant, correct criticism, that the horoscopes or the astrological diagrams that he is working on early on, let's say before the breakdown, come back in a new diagrammatic schema, or that's redundant, but a new diagrammatic form in the Bilderreihen. And they're still there, so that aspects of the hieroglyphic remain active, imminent, operative, but the diagrammatic form of the Bilderreihe managed to manipulate it and give new meaning to it. Not necessarily iconographic meaning, but some sort of combinatorial, what I call combinatorial.
Yeah, but exactly the Bilder Atlas and the Bilderreihen, there he developed an alternative. And
Yes.
Somehow it's a solution because he does not follow historiographic line and classification, but it's similar to a memory trace. The way how images and paintings themselves
I agree
form
entirely.
a kind of memory trace.
I think at this point we should open up the discussion to members of the audience. So if anyone would like to make observations or ask questions, one per customer, as we've been warned.
Hi, this is a question for Sigrid Weigel. I'm over here, I'm waving. Can you see me? Hi. And a direct follow-up to what you just said. Obviously, I mean, at a certain point in the history of knowledge, there was a moment at which system and history would have been perfectly compatible, and that would have been idealism.
It would?
That would have been idealismus, would have been idealism. And my question is, was Warburg in that moment, in that attempt of bringing systematicity or a certain notion of systematicity and historical empirical studies together, was he maybe a failed idealist? I mean, you know, on a more meta level than actually failing at being an idealist, especially given the fact that the epistemological milieu in which he starts out as a student is characterized by that strange transition from German idealist philosophy into empirical or quasi-empirical sciences, where something that used to be idealist philosophy, say Kant, moves into the lab and becomes something that is early empirical psychology, for instance.
But one has to add the development of instruments and empirical tools throughout the 19th century, which was very important for the development of empirical psychology. And I would say that Warburg was very interested in empirical psychology, and that, I guess, is what David Friedberg wants to emphasize when talking on his impact for today. So what's comparable with empirical psychology today? But in Warburg's case, he not only referred to this, but he also tried to use algorithm and metabolism. So he took all kinds of scientific formula and approaches in order to try to find a scientific grounding for his concepts of symbol and other concepts. So I would say one can't draw a line, a historical line from a philosophical line. But because of his breaking through the borders of different disciplines, the effect is that he also took figures of knowledge from different disciplines. So it's a kind of experimental field. The notebooks are so interesting because it's a real experimental field full of all kinds of references to science. And then it's interesting to figure out where there are deadlines and where there are perhaps interesting developments which brought him to another step in his analysis. And I would say that the reference to conversion and inversion was one of this very productive moment in his attempt.
I guess we have to ask both the audience and the speakers to keep their answers and questions short.
I would like to ask Lorraine Daston a question. Your four types of exempla all seem to me to apply to Warburg in some way. Baxendal on the detail and sometimes the God or the devil. We've mentioned God in the detail, but we haven't mentioned the devil. Phil Fisher on the passions and the pathos formal. Wendy Doniger on the feeling, and then and finally the relation between the human and the animal in the field of knowledge itself. So I would just like to hear you say a few words about how you view Warburg's epistemology. Is this a knowledge project, or is it something beyond knowledge?
We have been exhorted to be brief, Tom, so perhaps this epigrammatic answer could be expanded over tea at some point. I think that Warburg's project of epistemology is frankly quite foreign to the one that I sketched. I'm pleased and of course defer to your superior knowledge that there might indeed be flashes of these strategies in his work. But I think that Christopher's depiction is quite accurate. This is somebody who is an anti-contextualist. And insofar as he is looking for patterns, he's looking for patterns somewhat in the way that someone making a mathematical model might. I was very struck by the observation that the pictures are almost deliberately of poor quality and blurry, so that the form, the skeleton, as it were, like an X-ray, stares out at you, as well as the combinatorial aspects that were emphasized both in the commentary and in Sigrid Weigel's talk. This is a very different kind, it's almost a Lullian epistemology of granular elements permuted, very different from the pattern of finding patterns in exempla.
I would ask two questions. One is for Sigrid Weigel and the other for... Only one? Okay, so for Andreas. Okay. Discovering things where we are not in quest of. Okay. I would say that this describes perfectly the experience of working every day in the library, in the Warburg Library, first. Second, the question is this describing the epistemic experience of a Warburgian art historian? do we discover things that we are not in quest of? If this corresponds to an actual heuristics of iconology now, Andreas, what is the difference between these two different uses of traces, indexes, etc.? First, on one hand, to find what you are in quest of. When you hunt, when you are Sherlock Holmes, when you are Morelli, you are looking for the name, and you find it. And, on the other hand, to find what you are not in quest of. So my question, simply, is it not necessary to divide the evidential paradigm between two different, even two opposite use value? Just a final remark, as an homage to Martin Warnke. So far as I know, Mexican Indians in the Chiapas area consider snails as emblems of sagacity.
Josh, I would not separate that. You cannot separate it. And of course it's the, but what I was trying to say in a certain sense is not corresponds, but answered to what Lauren Deston was saying. In the fragments, he is trying to bring that together, to sort of try to write the genealogy of his thought and of his findings and of his knowledge. Sagacity and accident, this both, because what you're looking for is what you know, and what you find is what you can only discern and discover when you are prepared. So you cannot, and so it's not only accident, and in this sense it has a certain systematic. And that, I would say, is maybe, this lies together all what we presented today, is this fight for system, fight for epistemology in a way. And I wouldn't deny, at least to Warburg, the great wish to establish a procedure. Yeah. And the snail, yeah.
May I ask a question to Rainy Dustin? I was quite surprised by your remark on Warburg not being a contextualist, because I assume that there are two Warburgs. The early one was certainly a full contextualist, immersing himself in Florentine archives, looking for context and so on. And I would add, looking for something and finding something else, which is the usual experience of somebody working in an archive or in a library, except if this person is looking for something, and then when he or she finds it, that's the end of it. But if this was not the case, and it was not the case with the early Warburg, certainly there are two Warburgs. So I wonder whether your comment can also be applied to the early Warburg.
I was thinking especially of the Bild Atlas, so it really is a comment directed specifically to the Bild Atlas, which I think is an extremely arresting example of a very different kind of epistemology in the humanities. I completely take Andreas Bayer's point. The fact that my very petite perception about exemplar was meant to be the beginning rather than to exhaust the project of an epistemology of the humanities. And I think this is a much different project. And to say that it's decontextualized is not necessarily a criticism. The beginnings of all formal models are to wrench phenomena out of context, to strip away as much detail as possible in the hopes of finding, as I say, the X-ray, the vertebrae, which hold the structure up.
Thank you.
Not so much a question, but perhaps an observation. It's very interesting. We're looking at Warburg as somebody who creates picture series, who takes notes, who draws, and who creates diagrams, would we hardly look at Warburg as an author of, let's say, traditional kind of texts. And this is very interesting. Warburg has written all his life. He's written literary every day, but he has a kind of, let's say, a fear of wrapping up, of concluding, of editing texts. He has published very little. And we are not looking at those texts, not today. And when I see the program of the next 2 days, we will go on not looking on his texts. And this is very interesting. And perhaps at the end of these 3 days, we know a little bit better why he has not published, or why he had not this concept of rounding up, concluding, creating whole text in a traditional sense. I wonder if somebody already today has an answer to that.
He had the concept, it just didn't work. He was constantly trying to write a handbook of something. He thought in terms of writing a book, but there were reasons why that didn't work. Microphone. I'm done.
Thank you. Maybe adding up to that a little bit. Many of the papers today mention the experimental nature of Warburg's endeavor and this constant searching, outlooking, ongoing inquiry. I wonder what the exact nature of these experiments then is. That might lead to this question of the systematization or the attempts to build systems. Because what Andreas in his paper quoted in this pseudo self-description in the Justi quote maybe indicates something like a different knowledge system, let's call it that. When Warburg there writes that when he describes Winkelmann as being someone who is predestined to act in a certain way and to find a certain pathway through life, to make a certain inquiry that is not maybe, or is that still experimental if it's predestined, and what kind of maybe religious way of structuring knowledge and academic inquiry does shine up in such a quote? To whoever wants to take it.
I would say that the experimental nature of Warburg's, let's say, to answer Professor Fleckner's, or to incorporate Professor Fleckner's question as well, exists on the level of his writing, on the level of on a methodological level of trying to always reinvent or find new forms of seeing, of looking and writing or combining. I think it occurs institutionally with the cultivation of the library and through publication of other people's writings. I mean, just think of Ernst Cassirer's preface to The Individual in the Cosmos, where he credits the library as leading us in, I mean, to use the Viconian, or a new research direction, and providing us the materials to discover new facts and to know new things, both historically but also in terms of kind of second order knowledge as well about how our methods, whether our methods work or don't work. In the context of the Bilderreihe technique, it seems that, yes, there's a Lullian combinatory epistemology, and you have, Sigurd Weigel has written about this in your essay on encyclopedism in Warburg. So there's a long tradition that you could see him reinventing. Even just, I was thinking of even how he'll repeat the detail of a painting right next to it, a close-up, so as if to say, this is how I want you to look, this is how I want you to see, this is the direction I want you to spectate, if you will. All these are ways, I think, that he's experimental.
If I might add just a sentence or two to that, there is, of course, one absolutely respectable sense of experimental, just as Christopher has described it, which is the venture, the trying things out, the essay. There's another sense of experimental, which I think is singularly missing in Warburg, which is the experiment as the test. Warburg, and here I think Andreas Bayer's paper on serendipity was absolutely on the money, is very high in heuristics and discovery and very low in test.
I'd just like to make a very quick comment combining, or to two questions, one about Warburg's failed idealism, if that's what it is, and the other about his difficulty writing. I'd like to suggest that Warburg might be understood as an idealist defeated by his own modernism. I mean, like Walter Benjamin or like Robert Musil, he's coming out of a romantic background or tradition where the world should be able to be synthesized into a great book, but the new conditions under which they're all working show that it can't happen. So you have these failed projects. I don't know if that describes that phenomenon, but it might.
I just wanted to say something about low in text. Well, Uwe Fleckner is right in saying that he published little, and what he published was not very thick. It was quite thin, booklets and articles. So it is not low in text. I would say it is short.
Oh, excuse me.
And
Test.
this is a virtue.
Also, Probe statt Text.
Yeah.
Also ich meinte Probe statt Text.
Yeah. No, the only thing that I wanted to emphasize is there is not, to my knowledge, a study on Warburg's language. Not yet. There are some tentatives, but there isn't a systematic. And I would very much like to know what he read, where his language comes from. And I'm not talking about scientific or literary, I'm talking more on literary text, because his language is so much in touch with the tone of his time, you know. But I have a little question, since there are so many Warburg specialists, I totally ignore. Did Warburg knew and studied did he knew about Goethe's Rubrikenschema? These huge enterprise, total failure of Goethe to put Italian art into a scheme. I wonder, because that would have been a challenge. It's more or less the same procedure, but he did not finish it together with Meyer. But nobody has an idea. I don't know. I never came across.
I want to say something to
Hi, I have a question. It's more out of curiosity, really. We've talked about petite perception. We talked about attempts at building systems. We talked about making connections at the surface and, yielding as many possibilities as possible via combinations. I was wondering, Aby Warburg and Leibniz, do you have any comments or insights or things to say?
Well, the person you are asking sits in the first row.
May I add something to low in text afterwards?
No, I won't answer the question, but Gertrude Bing wrote her dissertation on Leibniz. So Leibniz was present without any doubt in this frame. And Heckscher did not by chance deal with petite perception. And the God who is present in the detail that has been said, so I would only add this, has to do with the concept. The only thing is that the petite perception is something below consciousness. That is the radical, the utmost radical argument of Leibniz. The body is thinking in begrifflichen, in terms of reflection, even when the body does not recognize that it has a perception. That is the most radical ever formulated solution for the problem if the body thinks or not. And Leibniz says absolutely, and it doesn't only autonomously reflect, it reflects in reflective terms unconsciously, and that is Freud, of course. That is Freud, and so here one could put all you have said on this day. Here one would put the associative power of Warburg. For example, There he works, and that is his miracle, in a sense, that he works through associations which are in the same moment, maybe wrong-driven, but in the same moment extremely reflexive. And there I see the connection to Leibniz without going too far.
I would like to add something to law and text. Because, yes, referring to his language, you would, yeah, but this is part of his text. I mean, this is part of yeah, but the way how he invents new words in order to construct combinations and connections of things that we haven't seen together before is so interesting. And somehow it sounds a bit as if he deals with 19th century German. And this is very often the case, but he does something totally new with that. So when he talks on phobisch geprägte Eindruckserbmasse, this is only possible in German, to bring so many words together, but it's a kind of producing a cluster of relations. You may call this a diagram in language, what he constructs, because he brings things together that had been separated before.
Wir sind uns völlig einig. I mean, I think there really is an acoustical misunderstanding here. I was talking about test, T-E-S-T, in the sense of Probe. So I'm completely of your mind that exactly a beautiful example of how rich he is in discoveries.
Okay. Test.
Yeah, that was a serendipitous misunderstanding. It's my turn. I have a hypothetical question to Andreas. Seeing that Warburg has produced little text and deeply trusted his visual inquiries and methods of gaining knowledge through visual practice, what would have happened if Warburg had had the opportunity to make exhibitions, have a room, space, access to the works?
Well, he made exhibitions, and we all know that the Bilder Atlas was meant to have text. It does not, in a way, but it was meant to have text. But I think he was somebody who was operating in images. He was disposal, arrangement. So he did. And what I wonder more is David Friedberg was referring to what Warburg today. I mean, if he had Google, I wonder if he could work with an instrument like a computer. I think he would browse a lot. Please.
To connect the dots, perhaps a little. Warburg was obsessively wanted to test his method on audiences, whether large and small. And so after the Hertziana lecture, for instance, in 1929, before and after, he tested the Bilderreihe method with friends and writes in the Tagebuch, yes, everyone is very convinced of what I've shown. And as Horst Bredekamp and Claudia Wedepol have shown in their book, he tests his Bilderreihe method with Einstein. And even though Einstein diagrams a drawing of Kepler's second law of planetary motion and wants to prove something else, Warburg, somewhat benignly, somewhat overenthusiastically, comes away convinced that his Bilderreihe method works. And so there's a kind of clashing of epistemologies right there in that meeting.
It is a very idiosyncratic idea of test as to whether or not your audience is with you or not.
Yeah. I've got a question which is sparked off by one of Andreas's comments. And I think it's perhaps ties in a little bit about questions about Warburg's method and the circumstances in which he was working. I was very struck by the sort of parallel and the contrast between Winkelmann and Warburg, because both of them spent a lot of time in the library, obsessively taking notes. And Winkelmann spent the first part of his career, slightly like Warburg, not actually getting anything fully together, but just trying to see what he could make from these assembled fragments. Now, there is a huge difference, and I think I'd be curious to see how people might view this. There is a real difference between working in a library, which is somebody else's library, which was Winkelmann's work, and which is what most of us as scholars spend most of our time doing. Where Warburg is unique is he worked in a library that he created himself, of which he was also, in a sense, librarian to some degree, as well as somebody carrying on research. So I just was sort of thinking, what do you think of the difference between these two different subject positions? The Warburg one, of course, being one which I think is probably fairly unfamiliar to most people in this room, but it might say something about the particular nature of the project in which he engaged.
As you said, in a way, he was a librarian. He was a collector and a librarian in the sense also that, as we know from the diary of the Bibliothek and other sources, he shifted and rearranged books in according to his current interests. But we know he did it also because he wanted others to find certain things. So he was trying to. Well, he was the one who organized what do you say, a controlled serendipity for others, because he wanted them to fall there and get on this book. So in this sense, he was somebody who was trying to offer others the same experience he had, but I think he wanted them also to go the same ways in a little way. So yeah.
Hello, thank you for...
I would like to ask you if Warburg, in one of his published texts, used such a schema. The Atlas wasn't published.
No. The closest, as I suggested in my talk, was the astrological schemas that he, in a sense, continues to read. Yeah, yes. Mary Warburg's drawing is published in the Schifferneue. And also, yes, there's several.
The Schifferneue, yes, but it's this documentation.
Not the ones that we're excited about, as it were.
Last question, please.
Thank you. Thank you for some really interesting papers. My question is about Warburg's criticism of epistemology of the sciences, just in the light of the opening remarks about the Warburg's renewed interest in biology and neuroscience. Just to the two speakers who were speaking about science, I'm worried that there might be a forgetting that Warburg, for example, in the snake ritual, is criticizing the methods and epistemology of science, which secures itself as science in relation to a savage or kind of lack of civilization of an other, and that there is a criticism of his doctors, of medical experts, of scientists in that paper, a criticism based on the idea that science itself is a contemporary mythology or a contemporary contemporary mythology. So I was just worried about that, and if you could say something about if you agree or disagree with me that there is in Warburg a criticism of scientific epistemology. Thank you.
Professor Friedberg.
I think the interesting thing about the remarks about science in the essay on the lecture on the snake dance, he makes a very important distinction, and that is about the magical forms of science that sort of breach distance through technological means, and those sciences which are dependent upon the body. I mean, he is very careful in the essay on the snake ritual to talk about the effectiveness of the hand itself, but this does not exclude science. And in fact, one of the reasons I think we need to attend to current biology is precisely because of the intervention of the body in its relationship with the human expectations of, the results of tests, shall we say, or magical effects, or effects that are once regarded as magical. So it's precisely the insertion of the body into scientific processes that I think he acknowledged. And after all, the serpent ritual was recalling a visit which he made in 1895, in 1925, when he was in Kreuzlingen. So there's quite a long evolution in his own thoughts. But it is very much, for me, I mean, I think the biology is very much predicated on the fact that this is a science that has to do with the ability to touch, the extension of sight into touch, which is very important for Warburg himself. So that's my opinion. Probably other people at the table will disagree. Many of you may disagree, but it's time, I think, for us to resolve our differences, to stop talking about diagrams, to attend indeed to the body. Please all come for a drink, and we will discuss more things tomorrow. Thank you all so much for your extraordinary patience.